Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to be taking a look at the PowKiddy RGB10 Max 3. Yeah, that's a handful of a name, and I'll actually do a segment in this video where I'll kind of break down how we got to that name in the first place. Now this handheld is kind of familiar in some ways. Number one, it uses the Rockchip RK3566 processor. That's the same one that we've seen in other PowKiddy devices, including the RGB30 and the X55. And like with those other two handhelds, it comes in at a great price. Right now it's actually $70 on sale, although I think around $80 will be the retail price. And so that's what I want to talk about in this video, is what makes this one different from the others and why it might be a good match for you if the other two were not. And we'll also talk about just some of the general shortcomings of using a PowKiddy device in the first place. These are not top tier handhelds, but they can give you some very good value. And so my goal by the end of this video is to give you an idea of whether or not the RGB10 Max 3 is the perfect fit for you, or whether or not something else from PowKiddy or a different company might be better. So grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as always, let's get started with the specs. And like I mentioned, this is running the RK3566 processor. And of course, we'll test its performance later in the video. It also comes with 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM, and in terms of storage, it has dual microSD card slots. Now this has a 5-inch display with a 720p resolution and an aspect ratio of 16:9, and the bezels on it are nice and thin. And the battery is fairly large, it's 4000 milliamp hours. Now on the PowKiddy website, they say it's supposed to give you 8 hours of gameplay, but I found the average with a mixed variety of games has been about 4. And of note, if you do plan on pushing it in those higher end systems like Saturn or PSP, I would expect only about 2 hours of gameplay. In terms of weight, we're looking at 221 grams, which is just under half a pound. And we do have a variety of connectivity options, including mini HDMI, 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi, as well as Bluetooth 4.2. And the RGB10 Max 3 will support a variety of Linux-based operating systems, and it comes with just enough Linux operating system or Jealous as its stock OS. And then my other notes include the fact that it has dual USB ports on the bottom, as well as stereo speakers. Now on the PowKiddy website, they have two different color options. There's transparent blue, like I picked up, but then there's also a yellow color. And by default, it's only going to come with a 16GB operating system card, but if you want to get an expansion card, which will come with a bunch of games, you can also choose that. And of course, that will increase the price. Now, on the website, it does say that it costs $90, but like I mentioned in the intro, it's actually on sale for the next month or so, and so it's actually $20 off if you use this code, which is MAX3GOOD. And that deal is going to last until the end of February. I'm not really sure what's going to go on after that. Usually they will increase the price and then have other sales, so who knows. Either way, I expect the device to sell somewhere around $80 depending on what coupon is available and when. Another thing to note, even though they are only selling 2 colors right now, it seems to be that there are a bunch of others in the works. And these colors are actually listed on that same website, they just don't have them as available options just yet, so I would be on the lookout for these as well. Either way, let's move on to the unboxing. Now, I purchased this one myself. It took about a week or so to arrive here in Hawaii. And the box here has a little bit of an ornate design, which is not very typical for PowKiddy. Anyway, inside the box, we're not going to get a lot here. We have a quick instruction manual that'll just tell you some hotkeys, and it also comes with a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. So let's go ahead and take a look at the device itself. And first impressions here, I really like the look of the transparent color. In fact, I think this is the first transparent PowKiddy device I've ever used before. And I think they did a pretty good job. It has a nice light blue coloring to it, and it also is pretty easy to see through. I also like the texture of the plastic. It has just a tiny bit of grit to it, but is still relatively smooth. It's definitely not the prettiest thing on the back having this large battery just right here in view, but all the same, I still think it looks pretty sharp. And I also think it's complemented well with these painted colors on the buttons. I think that just is a nice subtle look. Now, second impression is this thing is surprisingly ergonomic. Not only is it rounded on the sides, but it has these little grips on the back as well. And I found these grips are perfectly formed for my middle fingers. It's actually a very natural feeling to wrap this around and then leave your index fingers up top. And the combination of these two fingers just kind of perfectly placed is actually really nice feeling. Now there's not a lot of space for your ring fingers or your pinky fingers, but I found that I don't really mind. It just kind of rests on my middle fingers and feels really good. And in this position, my thumbs just naturally gravitate to both the D-pad and the face buttons, which is a really comfortable place for them to be. And so when I first bought this device, I didn't think it was going to be very ergonomic, but it turns out that I think this might be the most comfortable PowKiddy handheld I've ever used before. I was pretty surprised at how naturally it sat in my hands. Okay, let's go ahead and start talking about controls. We'll start with the D-pad. Now this D-pad is very typical from PowKiddy. It's using a hard plastic, and it's also using a rubber membrane connection, giving it a more classic and retro feel. Now the D-pad itself is relatively easy to press down on, it has a good amount of travel to it, but one of the things I don't like about the D-pad is that it's a little bit sharp along the edges. This again is something I've seen in other PowKiddy devices before, and while I wouldn't consider this to be a deal breaker, if you're playing a game where you're moving around, like say for example with diagonals in a fighting game, it can start to hurt your thumb over time. So at least just in terms of feel, I would say it's a fairly decent D-pad. I wouldn't give it super high marks, but it does get the job done. But of course, the feel is only one part of the story, so let's move into the actual testing. As always, we're going to start with the contra test. In this, I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And ideally, my character would only move a little bit, but as you can see here, it is moving a lot. And again, I've seen this before with other PowKiddy devices, including the RGB30. And so what this means, because it is such a touchy D-pad, it's going to be prone to false diagonals. And depending on the type of game you're playing, that can be a big deal. For example, with Contra, if you're just trying to press down but you go diagonally instead, that can be a matter of life or death. However, for other games, for example Capcom-style fighting games, getting an easy diagonal is not a bad thing at all. For example, it's pretty easy to pull off a fireball or a dragon punch in this game, and so this I would consider to be both Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. So the D-pad experience is a mixed bag. In many games you won't even notice it at all, in some games it'll actually make it easier to pull off a move, and then in others it might be a problem. Moving on, let's talk about the start and select buttons. These are placed right next to the screen in an ideal position, and they use a micro switch connection, and they are relatively loud. Let me give you a listen. So definitely not the end of the world, but not something I would consider to be a quiet button. Next, let's talk about the analog sticks. So these are very similar to what you would find in a Switch Joy-Con, and this has been the standard for cheap handhelds for years at this point. In general, I think it has a good range of motion, and I haven't found many problems with it, but one thing I did notice, in the PSP emulator in particular, it did not give me a full range of motion. As you can see, it moves in a circular fashion, and then only really hits 100% on the left and upper sides. Thankfully, in the PSP emulator, it's pretty easy. You can go into the settings and the controls, and then I would recommend changing it to a circular stick input, and then also increase the sensitivity by a bit, maybe about 1.2 instead of 1.1. And I found with those quick tweaks, it does make the PSP emulator work a lot better. And to be honest, this was the only emulator where I actually had problems when it came to controls. In all the other games, like arcade games or something else that uses an analog input, it actually worked out pretty well. So no major complaints about the analog stick, just the fact that you have to go into that PSP emulator and recalibrate it a little bit. Moving on to the face buttons, so these also use a rubber membrane connection like the D-pad, and these also have a good amount of travel to them. They're very satisfying to press down on. I will say that the buttons are seated a little bit high on the device, and so as a result they have a little bit of wobble or play to them, but in general I wouldn't consider that to be a huge deal either. It just makes them feel a little bit on the cheap side, but still very playable. Now taking a look at the bottom, we have our two stereo speakers. We will check these more when we do a teardown. And then we've also got our two micro SD card slots, a headphone jack, and then our two USB-C ports as well. And looking in the micro SD card slot, it comes with a cheap 16GB card, and this is going to be preloaded with the Jealous operating system. From there, you would put a second micro SD card in the other slot, and then you would put all your games on that one. And I have a bunch of guides about that process. I'll leave one link down below. One other thing worth mentioning is that the bottom here is actually very flat and kind of thick. And the cool thing is that means this device will sit upright. There are very few devices that can do that, and so it's kind of a neat little trick. Now, as you can imagine, the viewing angle on this is not great because it's just a 90-degree angle, but all the same, if you wanted to plug in a Bluetooth controller, you kind of have a makeshift stand right here. Next, let's take a look at the top. So on the left side, we have our volume buttons up and down. Of note, the volume up is on the left side with this device, like with other PowKiddy devices. And I think most of us are used to pressing the right button for volume up, but it only takes a few minutes to get used to it. Next in the center, we have a mini HDMI port, and this can be used to plug the device directly into a monitor or a TV. You will need to get a mini HDMI adapter or a cable that will go mini HDMI to regular HDMI. Either way, the great thing about the Jealous operating system is that it has full support with HDMI out. This means it's going to be a relatively plug-and-play experience, and when playing a game that's, say, for example, 4x3, it's actually going to scale it correctly on your screen as well. So this is always great to see if you want to play your device on a larger screen. If you want to go a step further, you could also connect a Bluetooth controller and then kind of consoleify your device. And this is always one of my favorite features of these handhelds because it basically doubles its utility. One other thing worth noting is that it also supports multiplayer. So for example, right here, I have one controller plugged in via Bluetooth, and then I'm also using the onboard controls. Okay, beyond the HDMI, also on top we have our reset and power button. And so now let's talk about the shoulder and trigger buttons. Now right off the bat, you can see these are stacked shoulder buttons, very similar to what you would find on like a Nintendo Switch Lite. And the triggers also have a digital input. That means they're just going to be on or off. There's no analog input here. But considering the vast majority of games you'll be emulating will only require a digital input anyway, I don't think that's a big deal on these cheap devices. Anyway, the triggers here feel very nice. They're easy to press down on and also are relatively quiet. And because this device is relatively small for having a 5-inch screen, it's actually very comfortable to reach up and press those triggers as well. Even if you are going to be using the analog sticks at the same time, it's not that far of a stretch. So at least from a controls and ergonomics perspective, I don't really have any problems using the analog sticks and the triggers at the same time. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this device is so compact. And then finally, we also have those shoulder buttons, L1 and R1. And these also feel pretty good. They are quiet and easy to press down on, but they are relatively thin. And so you do kind of have to make sure you have your finger in the right spot. But I found that after a couple days of playing, it was a very natural experience. So no complaints there either. In all, I think this is a very comfortable and ergonomic device. In fact, it's a lot more comfortable than I was expecting when I first bought it. And a lot of that has to do with the ergonomic grips on the back of the device. They just naturally wrap around my middle fingers. And so it's just a very nice device to hold in the hands. In fact, it's very natural to use the D-pad, but using the left analog stick while playing is not that bad either. And so I think this control scheme is going to work well in a variety of different use cases. Okay, one other thing I mentioned in the intro is just this weird naming convention, RGB10 Max 3. So let's talk real quick about how we got here in the first place. Back in 2020, PowKiddy released a device called the RGB10. This is a clone of another device called the Odroid Go Advance, and this was a pretty great device. I actually put a metal shell on my one right here, and it's still one that I pick up and play every once in a while just because it's so small and compact. Now the following year, they released another device called the PowKiddy RGB10 Max, and this one has the same chip as the RGB10. It's the Rockchip RK3326. But this one is a clone of another device called the Odroid Go Super. This one had a 5-inch screen and also dual analogs. But for all intents and purposes, from a performance standpoint, they're basically the same. Now, about 6 months later, they made another one. They call this one the RGB10 Max 2. This one used the same chipset, same screen, and everything as the other, but it came with stacked shoulder buttons and a little bit more of an ergonomic grip. After that, things were relatively quiet in the RGB10 Max space, but then last year they released another one. This one is called the RGB10 Max 3 Pro. And if you're confused right now, I am too. So they basically jumped the gun and went to a Max 3, but then also called it a Pro. And this one has an entirely different chipset. It's an Amlogic A311D. And this chip is pretty powerful. It can play up to some PS2 and GameCube. But the problem was, this one was riddled with a bunch of hardware and drivers issues. And so even though developers in the community tried to improve things, I never really saw this one take off. Well, flash forward about 6 months to a year, and now we have the RGB10 Max 3. So this essentially is the non-pro version of the other one, and it also uses a different chip. This one has the RK3566. So I'm not really sure how they went from a pro to a non-pro and then also changed the chip at the same time, but essentially that's how we got here, and that's why that name is what it is. Now the chip that's in this one is found in other devices, and I think the most closest example within the PowKiddy line is this device, the X55. Now these both have the same chip, but the X55 is a little bit larger and has a 5.5-inch screen instead of 5. And there are also some key differences worth noting, so let's go back to the original X55, the blue one that released earlier in the year. And I really like this device. In fact, at the time, I thought it was the best $90 device around. But it did have a couple shortcomings. For example, the analog stick is above the D-pad on this device, and so that doesn't make it super well suited for retro gaming, and I heard a lot of people didn't like the fact that the analog stick was up top. Additionally, there was this weird thing where they put the volume buttons on the bottom next to the screen, and so it was always confusing to turn the volume up and down. And finally, the other thing that was probably my biggest complaint about this device was just how loud and clicky the shoulder and trigger buttons were. And so let me give you an example right now. Now, a few months ago, PowKiddy quietly released another version of the X55. And there were a couple different changes. Number one, they changed it to a different color, so I have this white and black version here. And of course, some things are still the same. We have those volume buttons on the bottom and the analog stick is up top. But the big change they did here is they softened the clickiness of these shoulders and triggers. And so while I still would consider them to be loud, they are a bit quieter. So let me give you an example here compared with the new X55 versus the old. And finally, to round that out, I just want to highlight how quiet they are on the new RGB10 Max 3. And so I would say that's a night and day difference. On top of that, there are quite a few improvements over the X55 here on this one too. For example, they finally put the volume buttons up top, always love to see that, and then also they made it a more D-pad centric design. And considering that this chip is more well suited for retro gaming, I think that's a better fit. Now there are still some features that I think are better on the X55. Number one is going to be that larger screen. Like I mentioned, this is a 5.5-inch screen, and when we're talking about something like 4:3 content, that does make quite a difference. For example, playing a Super Nintendo game is going to be about 4.4 inches on the X55, but on the RGB10 Max 3, it's only about 4 inches. Now that's a subtle kind of difference, but all the same, if you're looking for the biggest screen possible on one of these cheap handhelds, it's not going to be this one. Another thing worth mentioning is the X55 has a 5 GHz Wi-Fi chip inside, whereas the RGB10 Max 3 only has a 2.4 GHz band. Now I think that'll be fine when it comes to, say for example, updating the OS or scraping box art, but if you're looking to do game streaming, I don't think the RGB10 Max 3 is going to be great. For example, just in my own local Wi-Fi testing with Moonlight, I found quite a few issues in that there was a lot of stutter and slowdown. In fact, it was so bad that I basically just looked at my computer screen while playing the device, so I guess it could work as a wireless controller, but that's about it. I wouldn't consider Moonlight streaming to be something that is a feature here on the RGB10 Max 3. Now I tried a couple different things. For example, I have a USB 5 GHz dongle, so I plugged that in, and while it did initially power up, I'm not really sure it was actually connecting. For example, once I had it connected, I could get it working with Moonlight, but I did find that the LED light on the Wi-Fi adapter stopped working, and then also the game streaming was just as bad as it was without the dongle. So all things considered, if you are looking specifically for a cheap handheld to do streaming on, I think the X55 is still a little bit better. Another device worth talking about from PowKiddy is the RGB30. Now this is actually my favorite device from them, under $100, and there's a lot of factors for it. I've made a couple videos about this device already, but one of my favorite things about it is the 4-inch screen. It has a square aspect ratio and it makes the device very small and compact. Now there are some concessions to be made. For example, I prefer to play many games in an 8:7 aspect ratio instead of 4:3 just to make sure I get more screen real estate, so it is kind of hard to compare them, but all the same, with an 8:7 aspect ratio, we are getting a little bit smaller of a screen size. So we're looking at about 3.8 inches at 8:7 compared to the 4 inches we got with 4:3 on the RGB10 Max 3. But as you can see, even though this screen is smaller, it still fills up the content quite a bit. These two devices are kind of at opposite ends. The RGB10 Max 3 with its 16:9 aspect ratio does have some black bars on each side, but the RGB30 with its square aspect ratio has larger black bars, but they're on the top and the bottom. And if I had to choose between the two, I'd rather have bars on the top and bottom because it's easier to make the device more compact. Anyway, it really comes down to personal preference, but when it comes to retro gaming, I still prefer the RGB30, and these both have the same chipset, so it's really not going to be a performance difference between the two at all. Anyway, just to give you a better scale of what the size is going to be like on the RGB10 Max 3, let's do a couple other devices. First up, we have the PlayStation Vita. This one also has a 5-inch 16:9 aspect ratio display, but the bezels on this one are larger, but the device is also a bit more compact. So in the end, it just kind of evens out. Up next, we have the Nintendo Switch Lite. This has a 5.5-inch screen and is a little bit bigger. And then we have the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. Now this one is in a different price category. This one's about $200. And the screen on this one's a little bit smaller. It's 4.9 inches, but it's a lot more powerful. It can play up to PS2 and GameCube. And then finally, we have the Odin 2. This one has a 6-inch screen and is a lot more expensive, so it's not a good comparison between the two other than the size. When it comes down to it, I think that the RGB10 Max 3 is a nice compact form factor and size, but I wouldn't necessarily call it pocketable unless you have something like shorts on with larger pockets. It's still something I would consider to be portable. You could throw it inside of a case and then in a bag, no problem there, but it's also big enough to enjoy just kind of relaxing on the couch as well. So overall, I think it's a relatively diverse size. You can use this in a variety of different contexts. Okay, let's talk about weight. This is 221 grams, which is relatively light for its size. As an example, it's a little bit heavier than the RGB30 and the PlayStation Vita. However, it's lighter than a lot of other devices that are at a similar size, including the Retro Pocket 4 Pro, the Nintendo Switch Lite, and the PowKiddy X55. And then of course it's quite a bit lighter than the Odin 2. Okay, next let's talk about charging, and this can be a little bit finicky. For example, on the website it says it can support fast charging with USB-C. But I found that will really depend on the cable and the brick that you're using. For example, here with my Power Delivery 65-watt charger, it doesn't charge it at all. However, with the USB-A to USB-C cable, absolutely no problem, and then also C-to-C cables will work, but it will depend on the plug. I found a variety of different ones will work and others won't. And it doesn't matter what wattage you're actually going to be pushing into the device because it will only support a slow charge anyway. So I would say for best results, I would use a USB-A to USB-C cable, but you might be pleasantly surprised to find that some C-to-C cables will work as well. Anyway, that's about it for hardware, so let's move into the software experience. First thing, when starting it up, you will see that there's an LED light on the right side of the screen, and it does get relatively bright, especially on this transparent model. Now, like I mentioned, this does come with the Jealous operating system stock, and if we go into the system settings, you can see that the build date is actually sometime in November of 23. However, after talking to the development team, they think it's actually a much older version that they just changed the timestamp on. So let's do a couple things to spruce this up. First, I'm going to put in my second SD card, and I'm just going to cheat a little bit. I'm actually just going to use mine from the X55. If this is your first time working with one of these devices, I will leave my starter guide for the RGB30 down below. It's going to be the exact same process. Anyway, now that I've added that second SD card, you can see that I now have access to all of my games library right here. And I actually timed the review of this video to coincide with the updated release of Jealous because this device is now actually officially supported by that community development team. And so as of making this video, if you connect to Wi-Fi with the stock operating system, you can go into System Settings, and here you can choose to start the update process, and it'll update to a new version of Jealous, and it should fully work with this device. It'll take a few minutes to download and install that package, but once you're done, you'll have a brand spanking new version of Jealous working perfectly with this device. And it's very rare that you can get to this point where you can just update it over the air and everything's going to work perfectly. And so it's pretty awesome that we have this as an option here with the RGB10 Max 3. Now there's a couple of reasons why I like using Jealous with this device. The first one is if we go into the system settings, there's now an option to turn off the device LED. And so if you like, you can turn it red instead of green, or just turn it off altogether, and I love the fact that we have that option. Another thing I like about Jealous is that we have different display options. So in addition to adjusting the brightness, we can also adjust things like gamma and contrast and saturation. I found that giving it a 10% boost in saturation really makes the colors pop, but that's all going to be up to you. Another nice thing about Jealous is that most of the tweaks you'll want to do to the emulators can be done within the Jealous menu. To do this, I would recommend going into the game settings section, and here you can adjust some things like integer scaling and shaders. But the most powerful part is that you can go into the per system advanced configuration. Within here, you can choose your emulator and then also make your adjustments depending on that game system that you're using. So for example, with Game Boy, I can go in here and adjust the colorization to DMG, and that's going to apply to any Game Boy game that I play from now on. Next, let's talk a little bit about the screen. So in general, I found that I keep it at around a 50% brightness because this is a very bright screen. And the other great thing about it is that it also gets very dim. At a 10% brightness, this is something you could easily play in the dark. And at 100%, it is impressively bright. For example, here I am outdoors in a late afternoon. I am under shade, but all the same, you can see that the screen is perfectly clear. Now, it's not going to be perfect. For example, if I angle it in direct sunlight, you can see that it is a little bit harder to see, but the fact that we can see it at all is actually pretty impressive. All the same, I think it is bright enough to be able to use in a very lit environment. For example, I wouldn't want to play it in bright sunlight, but if you were maybe sitting in the parking lot in your car, I think it would be just fine. So really, it gets full marks for me when it comes to the dynamic range between brightness and dimness. Another thing I like about the screen is that it has a fairly high resolution. It's 720p, and that will work pretty good when it comes to scaling for retro games. Let's start with Game Boy Advance as an example. I'm going to go into RetroArch and then adjust the video settings. And here, if I turn on and off the integer scale, you can see that it's not a huge range of difference. This means if you want to use integer scale, it is going to give you some slight black bars around the sides. But then also if you want to use non-integer scaling to blow up the screen, you're still going to get some pretty balanced pixels. For me personally, I found that I actually don't mind using it with non-integer scaling. Yes, it's not going to be perfectly square pixels, pixels, but all the same, I think it looks good enough. And so that's how I've been playing Game Boy Advance, and I think it looks really good. Let's do one more example, but with Super Nintendo. And you can see here also when I toggle the integer scale on and off, it's not that big of a difference. And that's the nice thing about having a high resolution screen, because it gives you that choice. So if you want to make sure you have square pixels, you can use integer scaling and it's still not going to look too bad. And because the bezels are so small, it's really not going to be that noticeable at all. And then of course, if you don't want to use integer scaling at all, it's still going to look very good. And finally, before we get into game testing, let's do one quick audio test. And I think the audio here is pretty good. I don't have high expectations considering the fact that this is well under $100, but I think it gets decently loud and the audio is relatively clear. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get into the game testing now to show you exactly what you can and cannot play on the RGB10 Max 3. We'll start with the really easy systems, so things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, these are all going to play just fine. One thing of note is because these are a 10:9 aspect ratio, you are going to get some fairly thick bars on the left and right, and it's going to be up to you whether or not this is something that bothers you or you can live with it. Now, Game Boy Advance is the opposite issue. This one is a much wider aspect ratio, and so as a result, these games look amazing. And so like with a lot of other wider handhelds, the Game Boy Advance emulation is going to be one of the highlights of this device. Moving on to home console systems, those that are at a 4:3 aspect ratio like Nintendo and Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, all these are going to play great. You're going to get about 4 inches of screen altogether, and when it comes to performance, all these games are going to play no problem. Moving on, let's talk about arcade games. So all your classic 80s and 90s games will play fine. Basically everything up to Killer Instinct. That one's not going to play at full speed, but everything else up to the mid-90s will be great. In addition, because we have a vertical screen, that means you can turn on Tate mode with the arcade emulators, and this will allow you to play the games on their side. You'll have to remap the buttons just to make sure they work, but this can be a pretty fun experience. It's not the most comfortable thing in the world, but all the same, it does look a lot better than trying to play these horizontally. I think that PlayStation 1 performance is going to be excellent as well. I'm playing these at a 480p resolution, and yeah, everything looks and plays well. But let's talk about some of these systems that will struggle on this device. Starting with Nintendo 64, I decided to keep this one at the default 240p resolution. It does make the pixels a little bit more chunky, but it kind of gives me a more retro vibe as well. Either way, that is going to give us better performance, and you'll find that many games will play at full speed. Now, it's not going to be perfect. For example, I wouldn't want to play GoldenEye or Cruisin' USA on this device, but I would say a good majority of games are going to be playable as long as you don't mind a little bit of slowdown here and there. And you're going to find that's a similar case with the other systems as well. Let's start with Dreamcast next. This one I played at a 480p resolution, and I also turned on widescreen cheats in the core options. And it makes a lot of these games look really good because they fill up the whole screen. Now, Dreamcast is not going to be a perfect emulation experience. This emulator will rely on auto frame skip, but all the same, as long as you're not trying to get perfectly accurate representation, this can still be a very enjoyable experience. And again, here I would say that probably the majority of games will at least be playable. You might get some slowdown here and there, but you might be surprised how many games actually run pretty well. It's not going to be perfect. There are just some games that aren't going to run well, and so you'll have to work around those. And I definitely wouldn't recommend buying this device specifically for Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, or the other two I'm going to show here in a minute. Speaking of which, let's move on to Sega Saturn. It's going to be similar here, but the performance will be worse than it is with Dreamcast. And that's just because Sega Saturn is really hard to emulate. This one also relies on auto frame skip, so it's not going to be a very accurate representation. But if you're not super picky about how Sega Saturn runs, you still might have a good time with some of these games. The way I've been thinking about it is that this will be great as kind of a trial run. For example, if you just want to try out some Sega Saturn games and you don't want to spend a bunch of money to get perfect emulation, this might be a good middle ground. But just bear in mind, if you're a Sega Saturn purist, this is not going to fit the bill for you. And then finally, the other system that kind of struggles is the PlayStation Portable. And this is really going to be dependent on the game. There are many lightweight games like Virtua Tennis World Tour that can actually play at a 2x resolution. And this is going to be an awesome experience. These games are going to look great, they're going to fill up the whole screen and also have a sharp resolution. And there's also going to be a good chunk of games that'll play just fine at a native resolution. It's going to be a little bit chunkier looking, but all the same, I think it's still totally playable. Other games, you'll have to go in and adjust the PSP emulator settings. For example, with Ridge Racer, you have to turn on the skip buffer effects in order to get it at a more playable speed. And even then, you will still get some slowdown here and there, but I would consider it to be relatively playable. Other games may require you to use a frame skip. This is going to make the gameplay a little bit more choppy, but still a lot more playable. And if you're willing to go in and mess around with these settings, you'll probably find that the majority of PSP games will at least be relatively playable. But again, it's not going to be a perfect experience. You'll have to spend a lot more money to get a better emulator in that regard. A couple other great things about using Jealous with the RGB10 Max 3 are that other systems like Pico 8 are going to be fully playable. This one's great because it'll actually connect to the internet and allow you to play games off the cloud. And I mentioned this system many times before. In fact, with my RGB30 video, I did a deep dive into it. Either way, if you want to play Pico 8, yes, it's going to work here. Just bear in mind the square aspect ratio is going to give you black bars on the left and right. Another thing you can do is play a bunch of PC ports. Most of these are going to be accessible through a tool called Portmaster. And a recent Jealous update actually gave you a really nice perk. If you go in and pick any of these games and then press the X button, it'll give you a side menu. And within the advanced game options for ports, you now can change the port controller layout. And so this will allow you to adjust the A, B, and X, Y inputs depending on the game that you're playing. For example, here with Super Mario 64, this is an excellent port. It runs at a full frame rate of 60 frames per second and then also is widescreen 16:9. However, with the build that I'm using right here, the A, B, and X, Y are swapped. So this is one of those games where you can change out the controller layout and make it even easier to play. Anyway, I think this is also a great place to play games on the RGB10 Max 3. Many of these games support a 16:9 aspect ratio, and so they're going to fill up the screen and they're going to look awesome. And I'll also leave a link to Portmaster in the video description if you want to read more about it. This is a really great tool. Okay, and the last thing I want to do before we start wrapping up is do a quick teardown and talk about my experience when it comes to tinkering with this device. To start, tearing it down is relatively easy. It's just 4 screws on the back. They're Phillips heads, so easy to access. From there, you can use a plastic pick to unclip all of the different sides and you'll be good to go. On the back, you can see the battery and 2 speakers. The battery is actually protected by a piece of material. And also checking here, these speakers are downfiring, so that does improve the audio. Now looking at the board itself, a couple things worth noting. Number 1, these are just generic Nintendo Switch Joy-Con sticks, which means you could swap them out for better sticks, including Hall sensor sticks, if you wanted to improve your controls. On top of that, I found it interesting that they have a full mini Wi-Fi antenna right here. And then also I did note that the CPU is directly in the center of the device, but they do have a pad next to it that is taller than the CPU. And so I do not think that the battery is actually resting on the CPU at all. Now from here, I wanted to tear down the device to actually get to the D-pad connectors to be able to make it a little bit less sensitive. However, I did find that after removing all the visible screws on the PCB, there were still a couple screws holding it down. And these are actually hidden behind the trigger buttons. So in order to access these screws, you have to remove the triggers. And unfortunately, taking off these triggers is not an easy process. And that's because these triggers are snap-on. And that does make it quite challenging to remove them. And so I tried as gently as I could to pry them open, but even then I broke one of the plastic clips that holds it into place. And again, I tried to be as gentle as possible, and unfortunately this is the only way to access this screw. So if you do want to go in and change out the rubber membranes or the buttons or adjust the D-pad, you're going to have to go and do this process as well. I'm not saying that everybody is going to break that little plastic part, but the moment I did, I was completely scared off from going any further. And so unfortunately, I didn't go any further in my teardown. I didn't want to have this thing completely broken. And so I just kind of left it at that and then tried to put the trigger button back into place. Now thankfully, having one of those little clips is still enough to actually hold it there, and so I was able to reassemble the device. However, now that right trigger is a little bit wonky. As you can see, it's not tightly fitting. And so this is kind of a bummer because I really enjoy getting into PowKiddy devices and trying to make physical improvements. But unfortunately, I found this device to be the hardest one to mod among all the other PowKiddy devices I've tried before. Okay, I think we've done enough damage on this device. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the RGB10 Max 3. And number 1, this is a comfortable device. I think that they really nailed the ergonomics. I'm not sure who they have working in their handheld ergonomics section, but that guy needs a raise. And I really like the screen. I think it would have been better at 5.5 inches, but all the same, I love the fact that it has really light bezels, but then also can get really bright and dim. I also think the color balance is spot on as well. Now for my transparent model, I also really like the plastics. I'm not sure how it's going to be with these solid models, but all the same, if you want to have something that's not very smudgy and has a little bit of grip to it, I think the transparent model is the way to go. I also like that it has a D-pad centric design. That makes it really great for most retro games, which is where this chipset shines. And I also appreciate that they improved upon the X55 in that the buttons are a lot quieter to press down on. I've also got no complaints about the operating system experience. It's pretty awesome that it comes with Jealous as stock, and as of today, you can just go into your network settings, connect to your Wi-Fi, and then update the operating system to the latest version right then and there. Overall, I think all these things combined are really kind of an insane value at $70. And of course, I'm fully aware that the price will go up to about $80 or $90 at some point, but if PowKiddy is able to keep it at $70, I think they're going to have a real hit. And let's put this into a little bit of perspective. For example, if you want to buy a brand new PlayStation 5 game like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, this is also going to cost you $70. Now, I own this game and I played through it and it was a really great experience, but it only took me maybe 10 hours altogether to get through it. Meanwhile, I have the potential of playing thousands of games for the same price on the RGB10 Max 3. And sure, it's not going to be a PS5 game, but it's kind of amazing that they're the same price. In fact, if we look at old games from the late 90s, you'll find that brand new Nintendo 64 games used to cost $70 as well. Anyway, a lot of this can be said about any other cheaper handhelds. It's just kind of a marvel that we can play all these games at this price. And I'm not sure why, but it really struck me about the RGB10 Max 3. Maybe it's because everything just kind of comes together in a really great way, and it's a really good value price. But of course, the device is not perfect, so let's talk about a few things that I didn't really like. Number one, I did find that the D-pad was too sensitive, and then I was also disappointed to find that I couldn't easily mod it. For a lot of other devices, it's a very simple process. You just go in there, put a little bit of tape around the pads, and then you can kind of fix that D-pad. Instead, with the RGB10 Max 3, I broke the device when trying to get into it, and that's not something I often will do. And so I did find that disappointing in that this device is going to be harder to mod than others. I also wasn't a huge fan of the fact that they reverted back to a slower Wi-Fi connection. This one's only 2.4 gigahertz. And that's still going to get the job done when it comes to downloading updates or maybe using retro achievements, but unfortunately I don't think it's going to be a great fit if you're trying to play game streaming. And then finally, this one's not really a fault of the RGB10 Max 3, but it really is only an incremental upgrade over other devices available from PowKiddy. After all, there are 3 other devices, including the RK2023, that use this chipset as well. And so while the RGB10 Max 3 does get a lot of things right, it's not a revolutionary console at all. In the end, if you're wondering whether or not I recommend this device, it's really going to depend on you. If you already have a device at around this price and performance point, then there's probably not a good reason to pick this up. And if you want something with more power, you can definitely find that, but at a higher price. However, there is no denying that this device gives you a lot of bang for your buck. I'm super happy with the $70 I paid for this device, and I would be just as happy around $80 as well. When it comes down to it, I think that PowKiddy has come a long way over the past few years. You know, back when I first started this channel, they were kind of a joke, and yes, their devices are still on the cheap side, both from a price and material quality standpoint. But all the same, this device is probably one of the best they've ever made, and I've had a lot of fun testing it over the past few days. So if this device checks all the blocks for you, then I think I can recommend it with a couple caveats like I mentioned before. I really wouldn't consider this to be an end-all be-all device. I think that after a couple years, you're probably going to be ready to move on. But I think in those years that you use it, you're going to have a great time, and then after that, you can pass it on to somebody else who's going to enjoy it as well. Anyway, let me know what you think of the RGB10 Max 3. Do you already have a device similar to it, or is this the one for you? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.